Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is stay silent. For 8 long years, that's exactly what Clara Whitmore did in the small town of Redemption Springs. Everyone believed she couldn't speak, that she was born without a voice. She lived quietly beside the old stone chapel, keeping to herself and her secret. Then one autumn evening, a stranger rode into town. Jacob Brennan was a mountain man who'd spent years alone in the wilderness, and he saw something in Clara's eyes that no one else noticed. She wasn't mute at all. When he gently confronted her by the chapel door, she finally spoke, revealing a truth that would change both their lives forever. What was she hiding? And why would her silence be the only thing keeping her alive? Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The autumn of 1878 settled over Redemption Springs like a well-worn quilt, familiar and comfortable in its patterns. The town sat in a valley, where the Montana Territory stretched wide and endless, framed by mountains that turned purple at dusk. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. The main street ran straight through the heart of things. The general store, the saloon, the boarding house, and at the far end, past the last row of houses, the old stone chapel with its modest cemetery spreading out behind like a grey garden. Clara Whitmore had lived beside that chapel for 8 years. Not in the chapel itself, but in the small caretaker's cottage that sat just beyond the church grounds, nestled among cottonwood trees that whispered their secrets to anyone who'd listen. She was 26 years old, though most folks in town would have guessed younger. There was something about silence that kept a person preserved, like a flower pressed between the pages of a book. Every morning, Clara rose with the sun. She'd dress in simple clothes, usually grey or brown, nothing that drew attention. Her dark hair she kept pulled back in a single braid that fell to the middle of her back. She had her mother's features, or so Mrs. Adelaide Brennan liked to tell her, soft and fine-boned, with eyes the colour of creek water in shadow. She moved through her days with the kind of quiet grace that made people forget she was there until she was gone. Her routines were dependable as the sunrise. First, she'd tend the cottage, then make her way to the chapel to help Mrs. Brennan, the Reverend's widow who'd taken over care of the building after her husband passed 3 years back. Together, without words, they'd sweep the floors, polish the pews, arrange whatever wildflowers were still blooming in mason jars on the altar. Clara communicated through gestures and expressions, through notes written on a small slate she carried, through the language of shared work that needed no voice. Adelaide Brennan was 70 if she was a day, with silver hair she wore in a crown of braids, and eyes that saw more than most people suspected. She'd never treated Clara like she was broken or damaged. She'd simply adjusted, learning to read the younger woman's face the way some folks read the weather. A slight tilt of the head meant yes, a gentle shake meant no. A hand pressed to the heart meant gratitude deeper than words could express anyway. The town had long ago woven Clara into their story as the poor, mute girl who'd lost her parents young and been taken in by Samuel Hartwell out of Christian charity. Hartwell owned the largest ranch in the territory, plus the feed store, and had his fingers in half the businesses on Main Street. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick through the middle, with iron-grey hair and a face that smiled easily but never quite reached his eyes. When he spoke of Clara, it was always with a sort of practiced benevolence that made people nod approvingly. "She's a good girl," he'd say, standing in the general store or outside the saloon. "Afflicted, yes, but the Lord gives us our crosses to bear. I've made sure she's cared for, given her purpose. It's the least I could do after her poor father passed." No one questioned it. Why would they? Samuel Hartwell was a pillar of the community, a man of means and apparent generosity, and Clara, sweet silent Clara, seemed content enough in her small life by the chapel. The general store was run by Tom Chen, whose father had come from China to work the railroads and stayed to build something lasting. Tom was 40, quiet in his own right. with careful hands and a gift for remembering what people needed before they asked. He'd learned Clara's preferences over the years. When she came in with her small leather purse and her slate, he'd already have her usual items set aside: tea, flour, a bit of sugar, whatever vegetables were fresh. She'd write her thanks on the slate, and he'd nod, and they'd complete their transaction with the kind of mutual respect that needed no elaboration. Tom Chen noticed things. He noticed, for instance, that Clara's eyes were quick and intelligent, that she read every newspaper and book that passed through his store, that she understood complex ideas and responded to humor with a smile that transformed her face. He noticed, too, that when Samuel Hartwell came to town, Clara seemed to fold in on herself, becoming even smaller and more invisible than usual. But Tom, like everyone else, kept his observations to himself. In a small town, a man learned what was his business and what wasn't. The arrangement had been announced 6 months ago at the church social. Samuel Hartwell had stood up, cleared his throat with the authority of a man used to being heard, and declared that he'd secured a match for his ward. Victor Ashford, a business associate from Helena, a man of means and position, had agreed to marry Clara despite her affliction. Wasn't that generous? Wasn't that kind? The town had murmured its approval. Poor Clara would be taken care of, would have a husband and home of her own. Never mind that no one had asked Clara what she wanted. Never mind that she'd gone pale as milk when the announcement was made, her hands gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles showed white. Adelaide had noticed. Tom Chen had noticed. But they'd said nothing, because what could they say? Victor Ashford had visited twice since then. He was a lean man in his 40s, sharp-featured and sharper-eyed, dressed in expensive suits that looked out of place against Redemption Springs' dusty streets. He'd looked Clara over like she was a horse he was considering purchasing, walking around her, tilting her chin up with one finger to examine her face. She'd stood frozen, her eyes fixed on some distant point, her breath shallow. "She'll do," he'd said to Hartwell, as if Clara wasn't standing right there. "The silence is actually a benefit. A quiet wife is a blessing." Both men had laughed. Clara had not moved, had not reacted, had simply waited until she was dismissed to return to her cottage, where she could close the door and press her back against it and try to remember how to breathe. That had been 3 weeks ago. The wedding was set for 6 weeks hence, early November, before the heavy snows came. The date had been chosen, the arrangements made, and Clara's opinion had not been solicited, because everyone knew she couldn't express one anyway. But she could. That was the terrible secret she carried, heavy as stones in her pockets. She could speak. She'd simply chosen not to, and now the choice had become a prison with walls so high she couldn't see over them anymore. She'd kept her journal hidden under a loose floorboard in her cottage. In it, in careful handwriting, she documented everything. The truth of her father's death. The way Samuel Hartwell had appeared at their door that night 8 years ago, all false sympathy and crocodile tears. The way he'd made her watch as he'd signed the papers that made him her guardian, that transferred her father's property to his control. The way he'd leaned down and whispered in her ear, "If you ever speak of what you saw, I'll have you declared mad and locked away where no one will ever find you. Or perhaps you'll simply disappear like your father did." Accidents happen. So she'd stopped speaking. It had been the only weapon she had, the only way to protect herself. If she was mute, simple, tragic, then she was no threat. She could hide in plain sight. And maybe, she'd thought in those early, desperate days, maybe someone would eventually see the truth. But no one had. 8 years had passed, and she was still silent, still trapped, and now the walls were closing in with the shape of a wedding date and a man who looked at her like property. The sun was setting on that particular autumn evening, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, when Jacob Brennan rode into Redemption Springs. He came from the east, out of the mountains, on a sturdy roan horse that had seen plenty of miles. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and a beard that couldn't quite hide the strong line of his jaw. He wore buckskin and wool, practical clothes for a man who lived rough, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who knew how to handle whatever the wilderness threw at him. He'd come for supplies and maybe a hot meal that he hadn't cooked himself over a campfire. He'd been alone in the high country for the better part of 3 months, trapping and hunting, and while he preferred the solitude to the complications of town life, even he needed civilization now and then. He'd stabled his horse and secured a room at the boarding house, and was walking back toward the saloon when he saw her. She was standing by the chapel door, her shawl wrapped tight against the cooling air, watching the sunset with an expression that stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't peaceful. It was the look of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, weighing their options, measuring the drop. Jacob Brennan had spent years reading the wilderness, learning to see what was hidden, to sense danger before it showed itself. He'd survived by trusting his instincts. And right now, every instinct he had was telling him that the woman by the chapel was in trouble, even if she was standing perfectly still. He changed direction, his boots quiet on the packed earth, and walked toward the chapel. She didn't notice him at first, too lost in her own thoughts, but when he was maybe 10 feet away, she turned. Her eyes went wide, not with greeting, but with something close to fear. She took a step back, her hand rising as if to ward him off. "Evening," he said, keeping his voice low and steady, the same tone he'd use with a spooked animal. "Didn't mean to startle you. Name's Jacob Brennan." She stared at him, and he saw her throat work like she was swallowing words. Her hands moved in what he guessed was some kind of gesture, but he didn't understand it. "I'm just passing through," he continued, staying where he was, giving her space. "Saw you standing here and wanted to make sure everything was all right." She nodded. "Once. Quick." Then she turned to go, moving toward the small cottage beyond the chapel grounds. But as she walked, Jacob heard it. Soft, barely audible but unmistakable. She was humming, a melody, low and sweet, probably without even realizing she was doing it. And in that moment, Jacob Brennan knew. Whatever the town believed about Clara Whitmore, whatever story they'd accepted, it wasn't the whole truth. She wasn't mute. She was something else entirely. She was hiding. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she hurried toward her cottage. She'd been careless, lost in her thoughts, and she'd let her guard slip. The humming had been unconscious, a habit from childhood that sometimes surfaced when she felt safe. But she wasn't safe. She was never safe. She reached her door and fumbled with the latch, her hands shaking. Behind her, she could hear nothing, which somehow made it worse. Was he following? Had he heard? Would he tell someone? Wait. The voice was calm, gentle even, but it froze her in place. She kept her back to him, her hand on the door, every muscle tensed for flight. "Please," Jacob said. And there was something in his tone that made her turn despite herself. He stood several yards away, his hands visible at his sides, his posture deliberately unthreatening. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to tell anyone. I just want to understand." Clara's mind raced. She could go inside, lock the door, pretend this hadn't happened. But he knew. He'd heard her. And something in his eyes, in the way he stood there waiting patiently, made her feel something she hadn't felt in 8 years. The possibility of being understood. She looked around. The street was empty, the light fading fast. Adelaide would have gone home by now. The nearest house was far enough away that voices wouldn't carry. If she was going to take this terrible risk, now was the moment. Her hand moved to the silver locket at her throat, the one piece of her mother's jewelry she'd been allowed to keep. Inside it was a lock of hair and a name engraved so small you'd need good light to read it. Catherine Whitmore, her real mother. Not the story Hartwell had told about taking in an orphan. She opened her mouth, and for a long moment, nothing came out. 8 years of silence had weight. It pressed down on her chest, filled her throat, made her wonder if she'd forgotten how entirely. Then she whispered, so quietly he had to step closer to hear. "How did you know?" 3 words. They felt like 3 stones dropped into still water, ripples spreading out in all directions, impossible to call back. Jacob's expression didn't change to surprise or triumph. Instead, something like sadness crossed his face. "The humming," he said, "and the look in your eyes. I've spent a lot of time alone in the mountains, ma'am. I've learned to read what isn't said. You've got the eyes of someone carrying a heavy burden. And the way you moved when you saw me, that wasn't the confusion of someone who can't speak. That was fear of someone who might be discovered." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She hadn't cried in years, had taught herself to keep everything locked away. But something about being seen, truly seen, broke something loose inside her. "I can't," she said, her voice rough from disuse. "I can't speak. Not here. Not where anyone might hear." "Then let's walk," Jacob said, gesturing toward the cemetery behind the chapel. "It's getting dark. No one will see us among the headstones." It was madness. She should go inside, bar the door, return to her silence. But 8 years was a long time to carry a secret alone, and this stranger, with his quiet voice and patient eyes, felt like an answer to a prayer she'd stopped praying. They walked through the cemetery gate, past markers old and new, until they reached the far corner where an ancient oak tree spread its branches overhead. The last light filtered through the leaves, creating patterns on the ground like lace. Clara turned to face him, and the words came tumbling out, clumsy and desperate. "My name is Clara Whitmore. My father was Thomas Whitmore. He owned land, good land, with water rights and timber. Samuel Hartwell wanted it. He tried to buy it, but my father refused. So Hartwell killed him." The words hung in the air between them. Jacob's face remained calm, but she saw his jaw tighten. "I saw it," Clara continued, the words coming faster now, like a dam had burst. "I was 16. I'd gone to bring my father his supper. He was in his office above the feed store, the one he owned before Hartwell took it. I heard voices, angry voices. I stayed in the stairwell. I watched through the gap in the door." She closed her eyes, but the memory was there, vivid as the day it happened. Hartwell was shouting about property lines, about water access. My father said he'd go to the territorial judge, that he had proof Hartwell had been stealing from other ranchers. Hartwell pulled a gun. My father tried to fight. There was a struggle. The gun went off. Her voice broke, but she forced herself to continue. "Hartwell saw me. I was standing there in the doorway, frozen. He looked right at me and he smiled. He smiled while my father was dying on the floor. Then he came toward me and he said, 'Poor girl, the shock has stolen your voice. No one will blame you for not being able to tell them what you saw. And if you ever do find your voice again, well, accidents happen, just like what happened to your father.'" Jacob's hands had curled into fists at his sides. "He threatened you. He took everything," Clara said, her voice stronger now, fed by years of suppressed rage. "He had papers drawn up, claiming my father, owed him money, that he'd agreed to make Hartwell my guardian if anything happened to him. All lies, all forgeries. But who was going to argue? He was a wealthy, respected man, and I was a traumatized 16-year-old girl who couldn't speak." "You could have written it down," Jacob said gently. "Told someone in writing." "He thought of that," Clara said bitterly. "He told everyone I'd hit my head in the shock of finding my father, that I couldn't remember anything from that day. That writing upset me, made me confused and agitated. He even had a doctor examine me, a man on his payroll who confirmed everything Hartwell said." She touched the locket at her throat again. "This was my mother's. She died when I was 12. There's a name inside, proof of who I really am, but Hartwell doesn't know I kept it. He took everything else, every document, every photograph. I'm not supposed to exist as anyone but the poor mute ward he so generously took in." "And the marriage?" Jacob asked. though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Victor Ashford is Hartwell's business partner," Clara said. "He knows what Hartwell did. He's probably helped him do it to others. The marriage is just another way to make sure I can never speak. If I'm Ashford's wife, I'm his property. If I'm his property, no one will listen to me, even if I do talk. And if I become too much trouble, well, wives have accidents too." The full weight of it settled between them in the gathering darkness. 8 years of fear, of forced silence, of watching her father's murderer prosper while she lived in the shadow of the chapel, waiting for a marriage that would be a different kind of death. "Why now?" Jacob asked. "Why speak to me?" Clara met his eyes. "Because you saw me. Not the poor mute girl everyone else sees. You saw me. And I'm running out of time. The wedding is in 6 weeks. If I don't do something, if I don't trust someone, I'm going to disappear into that marriage and never come back." She waited for him to back away, to tell her she was crazy, to say he couldn't get involved. Instead, Jacob Brennan looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I believe you," he said simply. "Every word." Those 3 words nearly broke her. "Why?" "Because I've seen men like Hartwell before," Jacob said, his voice hard with memory. "During the war, in mining camps, on the frontier, men who take what they want and hide behind respectability, men who count on other people looking away." He paused. "And because you've got the kind of courage it takes to survive 8 years of silence without breaking. That's not the behavior of a liar or a mad woman. That's the behavior of someone doing whatever it takes to stay alive." Clara felt something shift inside her chest, a small piece of the weight lifting. "What do I do? I have no proof. His word against mine, and he's made sure no one would believe mine." "Then we get proof," Jacob said. "And we get you somewhere. Safe." He glanced back toward the town, calculating. "I live in the mountains, 3 days' ride from here. I've got a cabin, supplies, enough to last the winter. You could come with me. Disappear before the wedding." "He'd hunt me down," Clara said. "He's got money and men. I wouldn't make it a day." "Not if we're smart about it," Jacob said. "Not if we plan it right." He looked at her steadily. "But I'm not going to lie to you. It would be dangerous. We'd be fugitives until we could prove what he did. And I'm just a mountain man, with no reputation and no influence. I can't promise this ends well." Clara thought about the alternative. 6 weeks until the wedding. A lifetime of silence stretching ahead of her, Victor Ashford's cold eyes and colder hands. The slow death of becoming invisible, even to herself. "I spent 8 years choosing safety over truth," she said quietly. "It didn't keep me safe. It just made me a prisoner." She looked up at Jacob, and in her voice was the strength of someone who'd already survived the worst. "I'll take dangerous over dead. When do we leave?" Jacob smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "We plan first. We're careful. We do this right." He held out his hand. "But I give you my word, Clara Whitmore, you're not facing this alone anymore." She took his hand, feeling the calluses, the strength, the steadiness. For the first time in 8 years, she let herself hope. "Meet me here tomorrow night," Jacob said. "Same time. We'll start planning your escape." They parted carefully, separately, Clara returning to her cottage and Jacob heading back to the boarding house. But something had changed in the space of that conversation. Clara's silence had been broken, and with it, the first crack had appeared in Samuel Hartwell's carefully constructed lie. Inside her cottage, Clara pulled up the loose floorboard and retrieved her journal. By candlelight, she wrote the date and then, "Today I spoke. Today someone believed. Me. Today I began to fight back." She closed the journal and held the silver locket, feeling the weight of her mother's name inside. Tomorrow night, the planning would begin. But tonight, for the first time in 8 years, Clara Whitmore went to sleep without feeling completely alone. The old mill sat at the edge of town, where the creek ran fast and cold over smooth stones. No one had used it in years, not since the new mill opened closer to the main road, and in the darkness it was just a shadow among shadows, its wheels silent and still. Jacob was already there when Clara arrived, 2 horses saddled and ready, saddlebags packed with supplies. He'd chosen well. Sturdy mountain horses used to rough terrain, dark-colored to blend with the night. "Right on time," he said quietly, and she heard the relief in his voice. He'd been worried she might not come, might change her mind at the last moment. "I'm ready," Clara said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Jacob helped her mount, and she settled into the saddle with reasonable competence. She'd ridden as a girl, before her father died, though it had been years. The horse shifted beneath her, sensing her nervousness, and she touched its neck gently, murmuring reassurance. "We'll walk them quiet until we're past the last farm," Jacob said. "Then we ride hard for the first hour, get distance between us and town. After that, we pace ourselves." They set off into the darkness, the horses' hooves muffled on the soft ground along the creek. Clara looked back once at Redemption Springs, at the distant lights that marked the homes and businesses she'd known for 8 years. Somewhere in one of those buildings, Samuel Hartwell slept, confident in his control. By morning, he'd discover she was gone, and his rage would be terrible. But she'd be miles away by then, moving toward freedom. They'd been riding for perhaps 20 minutes, still walking the horses carefully, when Clara heard it, another horse, moving, fast, coming from the direction of town. Jacob heard it too. He pulled his horse close to hers. "Into the trees, now." They guided their horses off the path and into the dense pine forest that bordered the creek. The darkness beneath the trees was absolute, and Clara had to trust her horse to find its footing. Behind them, the approaching hoofbeats grew louder. A rider burst into view, moving fast along the creek path. In the moonlight, Clara recognized the silhouette. Victor Ashford. Her heart stopped. How did he know? How could he possibly know? Jacob's hand found hers in the darkness, squeezed once. "Stay still. Stay quiet." Ashford reined his horse to a stop exactly where they'd left the path. He sat there, breathing hard, looking around. In the moonlight, his face was sharp and predatory. "I know you're here," he called out, his voice carrying through the quiet night. "Clara, my dear, this is foolish. Where do you think you're going? Do you really believe a mountain savage can protect you from me? From Hartwell?" Clara's hand tightened on her reins. How much did he know? Had he seen them together? Had someone talked? "You can come out now, or I can come find you," Ashford continued. "Either way, you're coming back with me. We can do this the easy way, or we can do it the way that leaves bruises. Your choice." Jacob's other hand moved slowly to the rifle secured to his saddle. Clara saw the movement and shook her head frantically. A gunshot would bring the whole town running. Ashford dismounted, pulling a lantern from his saddlebag. "I have all night," he said conversationally, lighting the lantern. "And I've done plenty of hunting in my time. Tracking a frightened woman through the woods. That's barely a challenge." He started toward the trees where they were hidden. The lantern light swung through the darkness, searching. Jacob leaned close to Clara's ear, his breath warm against her skin. "On my signal we ride, hard and fast. Don't look back. Follow my lead." She nodded, terror and determination warring inside her. Ashford was perhaps 10 yards from their position when another sound split the night. A woman's scream, high and frightened, coming from the direction of town. Ashford stopped, his head turning toward the sound. "What the devil?" The scream came again, and this time there were shouts, the sound of multiple people moving in panic. "Fire!" someone yelled in the distance. "Fire at the Hartwell Ranch." Ashford stood frozen for a moment, clearly torn between his pursuit and whatever was happening in town. Then he swore viciously and ran back to his horse. "This isn't over." he shouted toward the trees. "You hear me, Clara? This isn't over. I will find you." He mounted and rode hard back toward town, the lantern bouncing wildly as he disappeared into the darkness. Jacob and Clara remained motionless for a full minute after he'd gone, barely breathing. Then Jacob said quietly, "That fire wasn't an accident." "Adelaide," Clara whispered. "She said she'd help create a distraction." "She bought us time," Jacob said, "and proved she's braver than most men I've known. Come on. We need to use every second she's given us." They emerged from the trees and turned their horses away from Redemption Springs, away from the distant orange glow that marked the fire. Jacob set a pace that was fast but sustainable, and Clara focused on staying in the saddle, on moving forward, on the rhythm of the horse beneath her. Behind them, the sky grew lighter with flame and approaching dawn. Ahead, the mountains rose dark and promising against the stars. They rode for 3 hours before Jacob finally slowed, guiding them off the main trail and into a narrow canyon Clara would never have seen in the darkness. A small cave opened in the rock face, barely large enough for the horses and themselves, but hidden from casual view. "We rest here until full light," Jacob said, helping Clara dismount. Her legs nearly buckled, stiff from the ride and shaking with adrenaline. "Then we ride again." He tended the horses, while Clara sank down against the cave wall, her whole body trembling. They'd escaped. For now, they'd escaped. "How did he know?" she asked when Jacob settled beside her. "How did Ashford know we'd leave tonight?" "I don't think he did," Jacob said thoughtfully. "I think he suspected something was off, and he was watching. Probably saw you leave the cottage. But he came alone, which means he didn't tell Hartwell. Wanted to catch you himself, bring you back and play the hero. He said he'd find me," Clara said, her voice small. "He'll try," Jacob acknowledged. "So will Hartwell, once he realizes what's happened. That's why we need to stay ahead of them. Stay smart." He looked at her seriously. "This is going to be harder than we planned, Clara. They'll be hunting us. They'll probably put up a reward, spread word through every town and settlement. Are you sure you can do this?" Clara thought about Ashford's cold eyes, about the wedding that would have been a different kind of prison, about 8 years of silence. Then she looked at Jacob, at this man who'd believed her, who'd helped her, who'd offered her freedom without asking for anything in return. "I'd rather die free than live as their captive," she said firmly. "So yes, I can do this. Whatever it takes." Jacob smiled, and in the dim light of the cave she saw respect in his eyes. "Then we keep moving at first light. I've got a friend 2 days' ride from here, a prospector who owes me a favor. We can shelter with him, rest the horses, figure out our next move." They took turns, keeping watch through what remained of the night. When it was Clara's turn, she sat at the cave entrance, watching the sky lighten from black to deep blue to the pale pink of dawn. Somewhere behind them, Samuel Hartwell was discovering her absence. Somewhere, Victor Ashford was planning his pursuit. But ahead lay mountains she'd never seen, a life she'd never imagined, and the possibility of being more than silence and fear. She touched the locket at her throat and whispered to her mother's memory, "I'm free. Not safe yet, but free. That has to count for something." In the growing light, she could see Jacob sleeping, his rifle across his lap, his face peaceful in rest. A good man, she thought. A man who'd risked everything to help a woman he barely knew. And maybe, given time and luck, a man she could love without fear or obligation, simply because her heart chose him. The sun broke over the mountains, and Clara Whitmore rode toward it, speaking prayers of gratitude into the morning air. They rode through the day, climbing higher into the mountains, where the air grew thin and cold. Jacob led them along paths that barely qualified as trails, through stands of pine so dense the sun rarely touched the ground, across streams that ran crystal clear over beds of colored stone. Clara's body ached from the unaccustomed riding, but she didn't complain. Every mile between her and Redemption Springs felt like a small victory, a step toward something she'd thought impossible. Around midday, Jacob pulled a small leather pouch from his saddlebag and handed it to her. "Jerky and dried fruit," he said. "We'll eat properly tonight when we reach Gideon's place, but this will keep you going." The food was tough and required serious chewing, but it was surprisingly good. Clara ate while they rode, washing it down with water from a canteen that tasted faintly of metal and mountain snow. "Tell me about your friend," she said, finding her voice growing stronger with use. "Gideon?" "Gideon Walsh," Jacob said. "Old prospector, been working these mountains for 30 years. Never struck it rich, but he makes enough to keep himself in supplies and whiskey. Good man, keeps to himself, doesn't ask questions he doesn't need answers to. Will he help us?" "Already has," Jacob said. "I stopped by his place 3 days ago, told him I might be bringing a friend who needed somewhere safe to rest. He didn't ask details, just said his cabin had an extra room and we'd be welcome." Clara felt a swell of gratitude for this stranger who'd offer sanctuary without demanding explanations. "There are good people in the world," she said softly. "More than you'd think," Jacob agreed, "though sometimes they're hard to find among all the other kind." As the afternoon wore on, Clara found herself relaxing into the ride, into the rhythm of the horse and the vast silence of the wilderness. It was so different from the silence she'd maintained in Redemption Springs. That silence had been a cage. This silence was freedom, the quiet of a world that didn't demand anything from her except that she keep moving forward. "Jacob," she said as they paused to water the horses at a stream, "that compass you carry, the brass one, there's an inscription on it." He pulled it from his pocket, running his beers thumb over the worn surface. "My father's. He carried it through the war, gave it to me before he died. The inscription says, 'True north leads home.'" "Does it?" Clara asked. "Lead you home?" Jacob was quiet for a moment. "I used to think home was a place. The farm where I grew up, the town where my family lived. But all those places are gone now, one way or another. These days I think home is more of a direction than a destination, something you move toward, even if you never quite arrive." Clara understood. She'd lost her home 8 years ago, and everything since had been exile. But maybe home wasn't something you lost. Maybe it was something you built, piece by piece, choice by choice. She pulled out her own treasure, her mother's locket. Opening it, she showed Jacob the lock of hair inside and the tiny engraved name. "My mother died when I was 12. Sometimes I can barely remember her face, but I remember how safe I felt when she held me. Like nothing bad could touch me as long as she was there." "She'd be proud of you," Jacob said. "Taking this risk, finding your voice again." "I hope so," Clara said. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm being brave or just foolish." "Sometimes those are the same thing," Jacob replied with a slight smile. "The question is whether the risk is worth what you're fighting for." They reached Gideon's cabin as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible, like the world was on fire with beauty. The cabin was small but solidly built, smoke rising from its chimney in a welcoming column. A man emerged as they approached, weathered and lean, with a wild beard and eyes that had seen more winters than Clara had been alive. This was Gideon Walsh. "Jacob," he called out in a voice like gravel. "And this must be your friend." "Gideon, this is Clara," Jacob said as they dismounted. "Clara, Gideon Walsh, the most stubborn prospector in the Montana Territory. Only way to survive out here is to be stubborn," Gideon said, but his eyes were kind as he looked at Clara. "Welcome, miss. Any friend of Jacob's is welcome at my fire." Inside, the cabin was warm and surprisingly organized. Gideon had stew cooking, and the smell made Clara realize just how hungry she was. They sat around his rough-hewn table, and for the first time since leaving Redemption Springs, Clara felt something close to safe. "Don't need to know your story," Gideon said as he served the stew. But I'm guessing you're running from something that needs running from, and Jacob here thinks you deserve a chance to get clear." "That's the shape of it," Jacob confirmed. Gideon nodded. "Then you'll stay here tonight, rest yourselves and the horses. Tomorrow, if you're smart, you'll head north toward the high passes. There's talk in the settlements of a woman gone missing from Redemption Springs. Reward posted already." Clara's hand stilled on her spoon. "How much?" $100, Gideon said. "That's a lot of money out here. Lot of men would sell their mothers for less." Jacob's jaw tightened. "Hartwell works fast." "Man like that usually does," Gideon said. "But the high passes, hardly anyone goes up there this time of year, too dangerous with winter coming, which makes it perfect for folks who need to disappear for a while." "How long can we stay?" Clara asked. "Tonight and tomorrow," Gideon said. "After that, you being here puts me at risk, and I'm too old to be looking over my shoulder. But I'll give you supplies, point you towards some caves up in the high country where you can shelter. After that, you're on your own." It was fair, more than fair, given the risk he was taking. Clara reached out and touched the old prospector's weathered hand. "Thank you," she said. "You don't know what this means." "I know enough," Gideon said gruffly. "I know what it looks like when someone's running toward freedom instead of away from trouble. There's a difference, and you've got the look of the first." That night, Clara slept in Gideon's spare room on a real bed for what might be the last time in a long while. Through the thin walls, she could hear Jacob and Gideon talking quietly, planning routes and discussing supplies. She held her mother's locket and her father's letters, and she thought about Adelaide back in Redemption Springs, about what the fire might have cost her. She thought about Tom Chen and his quiet support, about all the people who'd seen her truth even when she couldn't speak it. And she thought about Jacob, sleeping in the next room, this man who'd become her North Star, her compass pointing toward a home she hadn't known she was looking for. Tomorrow they'd ride higher into the mountains, into danger and uncertainty. But tonight, for a few precious hours, she could rest and gather her strength for whatever came next. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the first hint of the winter that would soon blanket these mountains in snow. Clara pulled the rough blanket closer and let herself drift toward sleep. Her last thought a simple prayer: "Let me be brave enough for what tomorrow brings." They left Gideon's cabin before dawn, their saddlebags heavier with supplies the old prospector had insisted they take. The morning was cold enough that their breath came out in white clouds, and frost clung to everything like silver lace. "Head northwest," Gideon had instructed, pointing toward peaks that still held snow even in early autumn. "There's a pass about 2 days' ride, assuming the weather holds. Beyond that, you'll find a series of caves. I've used them myself when storms caught me out. They're dry, defensible, and hardly anyone knows they exist." Jacob had studied the hand-drawn map Gideon provided, committing it to memory. Now, as they climbed higher, Clara could feel the wilderness closing around them like a protective embrace. Up here, the rules of civilization seemed distant and irrelevant. They were perhaps 3 hours from Gideon's cabin when Clara heard it. Horses, multiple horses moving fast through the timber below them. Jacob heard it too. He immediately guided them off the trail and behind a tumble of boulders that offered cover and a view of the path they'd been following. "How many?" Clara whispered. "At least 4, maybe more." Jacob's hand rested on his rifle. "Could be legitimate travelers, but this isn't a common route." They waited, hardly breathing, as the sounds grew closer. Then the riders came into view, and Clara's heart plummeted. Victor Ashford led the group, his face set in grim determination. Behind him rode 3 hard-looking men, the kind who hired their guns out to whoever paid best. But it was the 5th rider that made Clara's blood run cold. Samuel Hartwell himself, looking furious and somehow smaller out here in the wilderness, removed from the trappings of power that had made him formidable in Redemption Springs. The group stopped almost directly below their hiding place. The prospector's cabin is another hour ahead, one of the hired men said. If they came this way, that's where they'd stop. Then, that's where we go, Hartwell said. His voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. And if that old fool helped them, he'll pay for it. What about the woman? Ashford asked. When we find her, how do you want to handle it? Hartwell's laugh was ugly, carefully. She can't come back and speak freely now, can she? But there are ways to ensure silence. An accident in the mountains, a terrible tragedy. The poor mute girl, lost in the wilderness trying to escape her savior. His voice dripped with false sorrow. Who would question it? Clara felt Jacob tense beside her, rage rolling off him in waves. She touched his arm, shook her head. Not yet, not while they had the numbers. And if she's already talked? One of the hired guns asked. If she's told the mountain man everything? Then we make sure neither of them comes down from these mountains alive, Hartwell said flatly. No witnesses, no evidence, no problem. The group moved on, and Clara and Jacob remained frozen until the sound of hooves faded completely. Gideon, Clara breathed. They're going to hurt him. He can handle himself, Jacob said, but she could hear the worry in his voice. And he's smart enough to play dumb when he needs to. We have to warn him. We have to stay alive, Jacob interrupted gently but firmly. That's what Gideon would want. He knew the risks when he offered to help. Clara knew he was right, but the guilt was crushing. Another person endangered because of her, because of the truth she carried. They waited a full hour before moving, taking a different path that would circle around Gideon's cabin rather than lead directly to it. The terrain grew rougher, the trees thinner, until they were climbing through an area of broken rock and scattered pine. It was late afternoon when they heard the gunshots. 3 shots, rapid succession, coming from the direction of Gideon's cabin. Jacob pulled up short, his face grim. Clara felt tears burning her eyes. They'd killed him. These men who valued money and power over human life had killed a harmless old man whose only crime was showing kindness to strangers. We have to keep moving, Jacob said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. Gideon bought us time with his life. We don't waste that gift. They pushed the horses harder than they should have, driven by grief and fear. The sun was setting when they reached the area Gideon's map indicated, a series of caves tucked into a cliff face that required careful navigation to reach. The largest cave went back about 30 feet, with a narrow entrance that could be easily defended. Jacob built a small fire near the back, where the smoke would dissipate before reaching the outside air, and they made camp in silence, each lost in dark thoughts. Clara pulled out her journal, needing to document what had happened, to bear witness to Gideon Walsh's sacrifice. But as she opened it to a blank page, something fell out. A folded paper she didn't recognize, the paper new and crisp. She unfolded it with trembling hands and recognized Adelaide Brenner's careful handwriting. My dear Clara, if you're reading this, you've made your escape, and I pray you're safe. There's something you need to know, something I should have told you years ago, but I was afraid. Afraid for you, afraid of what Samuel Hartwell might do if his secrets were exposed. Your father didn't just suspect Hartwell of theft and murder. He had proof. 2 weeks before he died, Thomas came to my late husband and gave him a sealed envelope. He said if anything happened to him, it should go to the territorial judge in Helena. My husband kept it in his private papers, intending to deliver it personally. But my husband died 6 months after your father, and in my grief, I forgot about the envelope. It wasn't until years later, when I was sorting through his things, that I found it. By then, you'd already been silent for so long, and I didn't know how to help you without putting you in more danger. Clara, I still have that envelope. I've kept it hidden all these years, waiting for the right moment. Inside is documentation of all Hartwell's crimes, forged deeds, stolen property rights, evidence of at least 3 murders beyond your father's. Your father was meticulous. He knew Hartwell was dangerous, and he prepared for the worst. I've sent a copy of everything to Judge Morrison in Helena, along with my own testimony about what I've witnessed over the years. I couldn't let your sacrifice be for nothing. I couldn't let Hartwell continue to prosper on the graves of good men. By the time you read this, the wheels of justice should already be turning, but know that it may not be fast enough, and Hartwell will be dangerous as a cornered animal. Stay hidden, stay safe, and know that you are not alone in this fight. Your father loved you more than life itself. He would be so proud of the woman you've become, of the courage it took to stay silent, and the courage it's taking to finally speak. Be safe, child. Be free. And when this is over, come back and speak the truth in the sunlight, not shadows. With all my love. Adelaide. Clara read the letter twice, then 3 times, her hands shaking. Her father had prepared for this. He'd known Hartwell was a threat and had documented everything. And Adelaide, dear Adelaide, had kept that evidence safe for 8 years, waiting for the right moment. Jacob, she said, her voice breaking. Jacob, read this. He took the letter, his expression shifting from confusion to shock to something like hope as he read. This changes everything, he said. If the judge has this evidence, if Adelaide's testimony is on record, then you're not just a runaway woman making wild accusations, you're a witness with documented proof. But Hartwell doesn't know that, Clara said. He's still hunting us. He still wants us dead. Which means we need to get word to the territorial marshal, Jacob said, thinking quickly. We need to make sure they know where we are, that we're alive, that we're willing to testify. How? We're trapped in these mountains with winter coming, and there are armed men hunting us. Jacob looked at the letter again, then at Clara. What's the date on this? When did Adelaide write it? Clara checked. 3 days before we left Redemption Springs, which means the judge has had this information for at least a week, Jacob calculated. If he's honest, if he takes it seriously, he should have already sent marshals to Redemption Springs to arrest Hartwell. But Hartwell's here, Clara pointed out, in the mountains, hunting us. They looked at each other as the same realization struck them both. He knows, Clara whispered. Somehow he found out about the evidence. That's why he's so desperate to find me, to silence me. He's not just protecting his reputation anymore. He's fighting for his life. And that makes him more dangerous than ever, Jacob said grimly. A man with nothing to lose will do anything. Clara thought about the gunshots they'd heard earlier, about Gideon's probable fate, about Adelaide back in Redemption Springs, who'd sent evidence that might have signed her own death warrant. We can't just hide, she said. We have to get down to Helena, to the judge, to testify in person. My journal, the evidence Adelaide sent, my testimony together, it's enough to hang Hartwell and Ashford both. Getting to Helena means getting past them, Jacob said. They'll be watching the passes, the trails, any route down from the mountains. Then we don't go down, Clara said, an idea forming. We go up, over the high pass that Gideon mentioned. It's dangerous, especially this time of year, but it's the last thing they'd expect. Jacob studied her face, seeing the opposite determination there. That pass is treacherous even in summer. In autumn, with storms possible any day, it could be suicide. So is staying here, Clara pointed out. They'll find this cave eventually, and winter's coming. We can't outlast them, and the weather both. Jacob pulled out his father's compass, watching the needle settle to north. True north leads home, the inscription said. Sometimes home meant safety. Sometimes it meant the place you needed to be, dangerous or not. All right, he said finally. We go over the high pass. But we rest tonight, start at first light, and we don't stop until we're down the other side. Agreed? Agreed, Clara said. She tucked Adelaide's letter carefully into her journal, adding it to the documentation that would hopefully bring Samuel Hartwell to justice. Outside the cave, night settled over the mountains, bringing with it the first snow of autumn, just a few flakes, but a warning of what was coming. Clara and Jacob sat by their small fire, checking supplies. planning their route, preparing for a crossing that might kill them just as easily as Hartwell's men would. But Clara felt something she hadn't felt in 8 years. Agency. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was fighting back, and whether she lived or died, the truth was already out there, documented and witnessed. Samuel Hartwell's reign of terror was ending. The only question was whether Clara would live to see it fall. They woke to a world transformed. During the night, snow had fallen in earnest, covering everything in a blanket of white that made the landscape both beautiful and treacherous. The temperature had dropped sharply, and their breath frosted in the air inside the cave. Jacob stood at the cave entrance, studying the sky with the practiced eye of someone who'd survived many mountain winters. "Storms moving in," he said. "We have maybe 6 hours, 8 at most, before it hits hard." "Can we make the pass in 6 hours?" Clara asked, already packing their supplies with quick, efficient movements. "If the weather holds and we push hard, maybe," Jacob said. "But Clara, you need to understand what we're attempting. That pass is over 11,000 feet. The air is thin, the trail is narrow, and one wrong step means a fall that doesn't end well." "I understand," Clara said, meeting his eyes. "But what choice do we have? Hartwell's men will search these caves eventually. And that storm will trap us here for days, maybe weeks. By then, we'll have run out of supplies, and they'll just wait us out." Jacob nodded slowly. She was right, and they both knew it. "Then we go now, while we still can." They saddled the horses quickly, checking and double-checking every strap and buckle. In conditions like these, equipment failure could be fatal. Jacob tied a length of rope between their horses, so, if one fell, the other might serve as an anchor. The climb began gradually, following a trail that switchbacked up the mountainside. But as they ascended, the path grew steeper and narrower, until they were leading the horses single file along a track barely wider than the animals themselves. Clara tried not to look down at the drops to either side. Instead, she focused on the horses' steady breathing, on the crunch of snow under boots, on putting one foot in front of the other. They'd been climbing for perhaps 2 hours when they heard voices behind them, faint but unmistakable, echoing up from the valley below. "They've found our trail," Jacob said grimly. "The snow gives us away just as much as it covers us." "How far behind?" Clara asked. "Hard to say. Could be an hour, could be 3. He scanned the trail ahead. "We can't go faster without risking a fall, and we can't go back." "Then we keep going," Clara said with more confidence than she felt. The trail grew worse as they climbed higher. Ice formed on the rocks, making every step treacherous. The wind picked up, cutting through their dufflug, clothes, and stealing their breath. Clara's fingers and toes had gone numb, but she didn't dare stop to warm them. Around midday, they reached a section where the trail had partially collapsed. A gap of maybe 6 feet separated stable ground from stable ground, with nothing but air and a very long fall in between. "The horses can jump it," Jacob said, studying the gap. "But it's risky. If they slip on the ice when they land, or if they balk at the last second—" "We don't have a choice," Clara said. She was learning to say that a lot, and each time it became more true. Jacob went first, backing his horse up to get a running start. The animal hesitated at the edge, sensing the danger, but Jacob's calm voice and firm hands convinced it to jump. Horse and rider sailed across the gap, landing with a scramble of hooves on the far side. Now it was Clara's turn. She backed her horse up, her heart hammering. She'd been riding for less than a week, and now she was asking this animal to risk its life, based on her inexperienced guidance. "You can do this," she whispered to the horse, stroking its neck. "We can do this together." She urged the horse forward. It picked up speed, reached the edge, and jumped. For a moment, they were airborne, suspended between earth and sky, between life and death. Then they landed hard on the far side, the horse's hooves slipping on ice before finding purchase. Clara nearly fell from the saddle but managed to hold on, and Jacob was there to steady her horse, to keep them both from sliding backward into disaster. "Well done," he said, and the pride in his voice warmed her more than any fire could have. They continued climbing. Behind them, the voices grew closer, and once Clara heard what might have been a gunshot, though at this altitude it was hard to tell the difference between gunfire and ice cracking. The pass itself was a narrow cut through the rock, barely wide enough for a horse to navigate. Wind screamed through it like a living thing, and the snow was falling so thickly now that they could barely see 10 feet ahead. "Stay close," Jacob shouted over the wind. "Don't lose sight of me." They entered the pass, and the world reduced to white and grey and cold. Clara's entire body shook with the effort of staying upright, of keeping her horse moving forward. She couldn't feel her hands on the reins anymore, couldn't feel her feet in the stirrups. She existed in a space of pure survival, where thought narrowed to the next step, the next breath. Time lost meaning. They might have been in the pass for an hour or for days. All Clara knew was that Jacob's broad back ahead of her was the only real thing in a world that had turned to ghost and shadow. Then, gradually, the wind lessened. The walls of the pass widened, and Clara realized they were through, on the other side of the mountain. "We made it," she said, her voice hoarse and disbelieving. "Jacob, we made it." But Jacob wasn't celebrating. He was looking back the way they'd come, and his face was grim. "They're still coming. I can see them entering the pass." Clara looked and saw shapes moving through the snow, far behind, but definitely there. Hartwell and his men refusing to give up even in the face of a mountain storm. "How far to Helena from here?" she asked. 2 days' ride down the eastern slope," Jacob said. "But they'll have fresh horses at the bottom. We're riding animals that just climbed a mountain in a snowstorm. They'll catch us before we reach town." Clara's mind raced. They'd survived the pass, survived the storm, but they were still being hunted, still in danger. And now their horses were exhausted, and they had pursuers who wouldn't stop until she was silenced forever. "Then we can't outrun them," she said. "We have to outsmart them. What are you thinking?" Clara pulled out her journal, the documentation of 8 years of watching and waiting. "We hide this," she said. "Somewhere they won't find it. Somewhere we can retrieve it later or send someone back for it. That way, even if they catch us, the evidence survives." Jacob nodded slowly. "There's an old trapper's cabin about an hour's ride from here, abandoned for years, but still standing last time I passed through. We could hide the journal there. And then we make a stand," Jacob said quietly. "Choose ground that favors us, not them. Make them come to us on our terms." They rode down the eastern slope, following a trail that was easier than the western approach, but still treacherous with fresh snow. The trapper's cabin appeared like a gift, small and weathered, but with a solid roof and walls that had withstood decades of mountain weather. Inside, Clara found a loose board in the floor and placed her journal underneath, wrapping it first in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. She paused before covering it again, looking at the words she'd written over 8 years, the evidence that had kept her silent and now might set her free. "If something happens to me," she said to Jacob, "promise you'll come back for this. Promise you'll get it to the authorities." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Jacob said, but he made the promise anyway. "I swear it." Outside, the storm was easing, and the late afternoon sun broke through the clouds in shafts of golden light that made the snow-covered landscape glow like it was lit from within. It was beautiful enough to break your heart. They found a position on a rocky outcrop that overlooked the trail they'd just descended. From here, they could see anyone approaching from the pass, and the rocks provided cover while still allowing clear sightlines. Jacob checked his rifle and his ammunition. "I don't want to kill anyone," he said, "but I will if it comes to that." "I know," Clara said. She'd taken Gideon's old revolver from the supplies he'd given them, and now she held it with hands that were steadier than she'd expected. 8 years of fear had taught her something about resolve. They didn't have long to wait. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, they saw the riders emerge from the pass. Hartwell, Ashford, and two of the hired guns. They moved slowly, their horses exhausted, but they were still coming. "Last chance to run," Jacob said quietly. "I'm done running," Clara replied. "I've been running for 8 years, even when I was standing still. It's time to face them." Jacob looked at her, this woman who'd survived silence and fear and had chosen courage over safety, and he felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't just admiration anymore. It was love, deep and certain, the kind that came not from ease, but from seeing someone's strength in their darkest moments. "Clara," he said, "no matter what happens here, I want you to know that meeting you, helping you find your voice again, it's been the most meaningful thing I've done with my life." She turned to him, her eyes bright with tears and determination. "Then let's make sure we both survive to build on it." They took their positions among the rocks and waited as Hartwell's party drew closer. The sun continued its descent, and Clara thought about Adelaide and Gideon, about Tom Chen and her father, about all the people who'd been hurt by Samuel Hartwell's greed and violence. This ended today. One way or another, it ended today. The riders spotted them and reined to a halt about 50 yards away. In the fading light, Clara could see Hartwell's face, twisted with rage and something close to desperation. "Clara," he called out, his voice carrying across the snow. "This is madness. Come down from there. Let's talk about this reasonably." Clara stood up, feeling Jacob tense beside her, ready to pull her down if shooting started. But she needed Hartwell to see her, to hear her. She needed to use the voice she'd kept silent for so long. "I have nothing to say to you, Samuel Hartwell," she called back, and her voice was strong and clear and echoed off the mountains. "Except this, I saw you murder my father. I've documented every crime you've committed since, and the evidence is already in the hands of the territorial judge." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Hartwell laughed, bitter and angry. "You think they'll believe a mute girl's wild accusations?" "I'm not mute," Clara shouted, and the words felt like breaking chains. "I never was. I was just too smart to speak when it would have gotten me killed. But I'm speaking now, and the whole world is going to hear what you did." Ashford drew his gun, but Hartwell held up a hand, stopping him. "You've been clever, Clara, I'll give you that. But you're trapped on this mountain with winter coming, and we have supplies and numbers. You can't win." "Maybe not," Clara said, "but neither can you. Even if you kill us both, the evidence survives." Adelaide Brenner sent everything to the judge before we even left. Redemption springs. Your reign is over, Hartwell. The only question is whether you hang for murder or murder and more murder. She saw the moment he made his decision. His hand went to his gun, his face hardening into the expression of a man who decided that if he was going down, he'd take everyone he could with him. "Get down!" Jacob yelled, pulling Clara behind the rocks as gunfire erupted across the snowy slope. Clara didn't think, she simply moved. She'd picked up a rock during their scramble through the boulders, a smooth stone about the size of her fist that she'd kept in her pocket without really knowing why. Now she pulled it out and threw it with all her strength, the same motion she'd used as a girl, throwing stones across the creek behind her father's house. The rock struck Ashford's gun hand just as he pulled the trigger. The shot went wild, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the mountainside. Ashford howled in pain and rage, the gun falling again, this time, tumbling end over end down the slope. Jacob was already moving, covering the distance between them in long strides. He reached Ashford before the man could recover, pinning him against the rock face with efficient, controlled strength. "It's done," Jacob said firmly. "No more running, no more killing. It's done." The marshal and his men scrambled up the slope, and within minutes Ashford was in custody, his wounded arm being bandaged while his hands were secured with iron shackles. Below, Hartwell sat on his horse under guard, his face the grey colour of old ashes. The man who'd ruled Redemption Springs through fear and violence now looked small and defeated, diminished by the weight of justice finally catching up to him. Clara stood watching it all, feeling like she was in a dream. For 8 years this moment had seemed impossible. Hartwell had been too powerful, too protected, too clever. But he'd underestimated the people he'd hurt. He'd underestimated Adelaide's courage, Gideon's stubbornness, Tom Chen's quiet observation, and most of all, he'd underestimated Clara herself. The Marshal approached them, his expression respectful. "Miss Whitmore, I'm Marshal Thomas Mackenzie. I need to ask you some questions, but they can wait until we're down off this mountain. You and Mr. Brennan should come with us back to Helena. Judge Morrison will want to hear your full testimony." "What about Redemption Springs?" Clara asked. "Adelaide Brenner, she could be in danger for helping me." "Already took care of that," Mackenzie said. "Soon as we got Mrs. Brenner's letter and the evidence, I sent deputies to keep watch on her. She's safe, I promise you." Clara felt another weight lift from her shoulders. "And the fire at Hartwell's ranch? Was anyone hurt?" Mackenzie's eyes crinkled with something that might have been amusement. "That fire started in an empty barn, stayed contained, put itself out within an hour. Almost like someone set it who knew exactly what they were doing and wanted to make noise without causing real damage." He didn't say more, but Clara understood. Adelaide had been careful, had created the perfect distraction without actually endangering anyone. The journey down the mountain was slow and careful, the horses picking their way through snow that was already starting to melt in places where the late afternoon sun reached. Clara rode beside Jacob, their horses close enough that their legs occasionally touched. Neither of them spoke much, both processing what had happened, what it meant. They camped that night at a way station, and the marshal posted guards around the perimeter. Hartwell and Ashford were kept under heavy watch, shackled and separated. Clara noticed that neither man would look at her now. The power dynamic had shifted completely. She was no longer their victim, she was their accuser, and her words would likely send them both to the gallows. Jacob found her sitting outside the way station, watching the stars emerge in the clearing sky. He sat down beside her, close but not touching, giving her space to process everything. "How are you?" he asked quietly. Clara said honestly, "I feel like I should feel something more. Relief, maybe, triumph, but mostly I just feel tired." "That's normal," Jacob said. "You've been carrying a heavy weight for a long time. It takes a while for your shoulders to remember they don't have to be hunched anymore." Clara looked at him, this man who'd become so important to her in such a short time. "What happens now? After the trial? After everything's settled?" "That's up to you," Jacob said. "You'll be a wealthy woman once your father's properties are restored to you. You could go anywhere, do anything. The whole world's open to you now." "And you?" Clara asked. "Where will you go?" Jacob pulled out his father's compass, the brass worn smooth from years of handling. "True north leads home," he said, reading the inscription again. I think I knew what that meant, but lately I've been wondering if home isn't a place at all. Maybe it's a person." Clara's breath caught. "Jacob, I'm not asking you for anything," he said quickly. "You've just gotten your freedom. The last thing you need is another person trying to claim you. But I want you to know that whenever you figure out where you want to be, what you want to do, I'll be there. If you want me. And if you don't, I'll respect that too." Clara reached out and took his hand, feeling the calluses, the strength, the steadiness that had kept her alive and sane through the worst days of her life. "I spent 8 years not speaking because I was afraid of what would happen if I did. I'm not making that mistake again." She turned to face him fully, her voice clear and certain. "I love you, Jacob Brennan. Not because you saved me, but because you saw me when I was invisible, because you believed me when no one else did, because you gave me back my voice and my courage, and you never asked for anything in return." Jacob's eyes shone in the starlight. "Clara, "I'm not done," she said, smiling through tears. "I know we barely know each other. I know this all happened so fast. But I also know what I feel, and I'm done being silent about things that matter. So here's what I want. I want to testify against Hartwell and Ashford. I want to see justice done for my father and for everyone else they hurt. And then I want to go with you to that cabin in the mountains and learn what it means to live free." Jacob pulled her into his arms, and she let herself be held, let herself feel safe in a way she hadn't felt since she was a child. "I promise you," he said against her hair, "I will spend every day making sure you never regret that choice." "I know," Clara said. "That's why I'm making it." They sat together under the stars, two people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances and discovered something worth fighting for. Tomorrow they'd ride into Helena. Tomorrow the real work of justice would begin. But tonight, for the first time in 8 years, Clara Whitmore could breathe freely, speak freely, and love freely. The silence that had been her prison had finally, fully, broken. And what emerged from those broken pieces was a voice stronger than fear, louder than lies, and true as the compass that pointed north toward home. 6 months later, spring came to the Montana Territory with a rush of wildflowers and snowmelt that turned the high meadows into carpets of purple and gold. Clara stood on the porch of Jacob's cabin, watching the morning sun paint the peaks in shades of rose and amber, and marveled at how much could change in half a year. The trial had lasted 3 weeks. Clara had testified for 2 full days, her voice never wavering as she described what she'd witnessed 8 years ago and everything that had followed. Her journal, retrieved from its hiding place in the trapper's cabin, had provided documentation that corroborated Adelaide's evidence and testimony from other witnesses who finally felt safe enough to speak. Tom Chen had testified about suspicious activities he'd observed at Hartwell's businesses. The Morrison family had come forward about how they'd lost their farm. Even some of Hartwell's former employees had turned on him, tired of being complicit in crimes they'd witnessed but been too afraid to report. In the end, the verdict had been unanimous. Samuel Hartwell was convicted of murder, theft, fraud, and a dozen other charges. Victor Ashford faced similar convictions, plus attempted murder for his actions on the mountain. Both men were sentenced to hang, and the sentences were carried out within a month of the verdict. Clara had not attended the hangings. She'd testified to the truth, seen justice served, and that was enough. She didn't need to watch men die to feel free. The restoration of her father's properties had taken longer, tangled up in legal procedures and documentation. But Judge Morrison had been thorough and fair, and eventually Clara found herself the owner of valuable land, timber rights, and a share in several businesses that Hartwell had stolen over the years. She'd sold most of it. The money was more than she'd ever need, even accounting for a long life and uncertainties. She'd kept her father's original property, the land he'd truly owned and loved, and donated it to the town of Redemption Springs for a school. The rest she'd liquidated and invested carefully, following advice from Judge Morrison and a lawyer in Helena who'd proven honest and competent. With some of the money, she'd established a fund for families who'd been victimized by Hartwell and other unscrupulous men. Adelaide Brenner administered it, her sharp mind and compassionate heart making her the perfect steward for helping others rebuild their lives. Tom Chen had expanded his store, and Clara had quietly paid off the mortgage on his building. He'd tried to refuse, but she'd insisted. "You saw me when others didn't," she'd told him. "That's worth more than money could ever repay, but let me try." Gideon Walsh had recovered from his wounds, though he walked with a limp now. He'd testified at the trial about how Hartwell's men had shot him when he refused to tell them which way Clara and Jacob had gone. "Took more than a couple of bullets to kill this old coyote," he'd said from the witness stand, and the courtroom had erupted in applause. Clara had bought him supplies for a full year and a new rifle to replace the one that had been destroyed. He'd accepted with gruff gratitude, and then invited her and Jacob to visit any time they were in his part of the mountains. But the person Clara thought about most was Adelaide Brenner. The old woman had risked everything to send that evidence to the judge, to set in motion the events that had freed Clara and brought down Hartwell. When Clara had tried to thank her after the trial, Adelaide had simply hugged her and said, "Child, watching you find your voice again is all the thanks I need." Adelaide had moved into a comfortable house in town, funded by a pension Clara had quietly established. They corresponded regularly, Adelaide's letters full of news about Redemption Springs and warm encouragement for Clara's new life. That new life was simpler than anything Clara had imagined during her years of silence. She and Jacob had married in a quiet ceremony in Helena, with Judge Morrison officiating and Marshal Mackenzie standing as witness. No fancy dress, no elaborate celebration, just two people committing to build a life together based on trust and respect and love. They'd returned to Jacob's cabin, and Clara had fallen in love with it immediately. The isolation that might have felt lonely to someone else felt like freedom to her. Up here, she could speak or be silent as she chose. She could laugh loudly, sing off-key, or sit in comfortable quiet with Jacob by the fire. Every choice was hers, and that made each one precious. She'd learned to hunt and fish, to read the weather and the seasons. She'd planted a garden that she tended with the same care she'd once given to the flowers at the chapel. She'd started writing again, not just journals now, but stories, observations, reflections on freedom and courage, and the long journey from silence to voice. Jacob had taught her about the mountains, about survival and self-sufficiency, but he'd also learned from her about patience and healing, about the strength it took to survive, not with weapons, but with wisdom and endurance. They talked for hours by firelight, sharing dreams and fears, building the kind of intimacy that came from truly seeing and being seen. And sometimes they sat in silence, but it was a different silence now, comfortable, chosen. The silence of two people who were so secure in their connection that words became optional rather than essential. Clara heard the door open behind her and turned to see Jacob carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one and stood beside her, his shoulder touching hers, both of them looking out at the mountains they called home. "Thinking about anything in particular?" he asked. "Everything," Clara said. "About how much has changed, about how scared I was 6 months ago, about how free I feel now." Jacob smiled. "Any regrets?" "Not a single one." Clara sipped her coffee, feeling the warmth spread through her. "Well, maybe one small regret. I wish I could go back and tell that frightened 16-year-old girl that she was going to survive, that she was going to be more than her fear. That 8 years of silence wouldn't be the end of her story, just a chapter in a much longer book." "I think she knew," Jacob said gently. "Otherwise, she wouldn't have kept that journal, wouldn't have documented everything so carefully. Part of her always believed she'd get to speak the truth someday." Clara considered that and realized he was right. Even in her darkest moments, some small spark of hope had kept burning. Some belief that truth mattered, that justice existed, that her voice had value even when she couldn't use it. "What about you?" she asked. "Are you happy up here with a wife who talks your ear off after years of choosing silence?" Jacob laughed. "Clara, I spent years alone in these mountains because I thought I preferred solitude. Turns out I was just waiting for the right person to break the silence with." He set down his coffee cup and took both her hands in his. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. You know that, right?" "I do," Clara said, and those 2 words held all the certainty she'd found in the past 6 months. "And you're the best thing that's happened to me. You gave me back my voice, Jacob." "No, that's not right. You helped me remember I always had it. I just needed to be brave enough to use it." A hawk cried overhead, circling on the morning thermals. In the pulled valley below, wildflowers were beginning to bloom, and the world felt new and full of possibility. Clara had spent 8 years learning that sometimes survival meant silence, but she'd spent the last 6 months learning something even more important, that once you were safe, once you were free, your voice became the most powerful tool you possessed. Not just for telling your own story, but for helping others find the courage to tell theirs. She thought about all the letters she'd received from women who'd heard about her story, about her testimony, about how she'd survived and found justice. Women who were finding their own courage to speak, to leave, to fight back against the people and circumstances that had silenced them. That was legacy, Clara realized. Not the money or the property or even the justice. The real legacy was showing that silence didn't have to be permanent, that fear could be overcome, that speaking truth was worth whatever risks it carried. "Come on, Jacob," said, tugging her hand gently. "We've got a long ride ahead if we're going to check those trap lines before the afternoon storm rolls in." Clara followed him inside to gather their supplies, to prepare for a day in the mountains doing work that was hard and honest and entirely their choice. This was freedom, she thought, not the absence of challenges, but the presence of choice. Not the absence of fear, but the courage to face it anyway. As they saddled the horses and set out into the spring morning, Clara began to sing. Her voice carried across the meadows, strong and clear and unafraid. It was a song her mother had taught her, about wild flowers and mountain streams, about finding beauty in hard places. Jacob joined in on the chorus, his deeper voice blending with hers in harmony. Two voices, raised in song, echoing off the mountains that had witnessed their struggle and now sheltered their joy. Clara Whitmore, who had been silent for 8 years, had finally come home to herself. And in that homecoming, she'd found not just her voice, but her courage, her strength, and a love that asked nothing of her except that she continue being exactly who she'd become. A woman who survived, who fought, who spoke truth even when it was dangerous. A woman who was, at last and forever, free.